Have you ever felt that strange kind of tiredness where your body feels fine, your day is not overwhelming, yet your mind feels worn out, scattered, and heavy, as if it has been quietly running for far too long? In this audiobook, we will explore why mental energy often does not return through sleep or rest, and how the mind can regain clarity, focus, and freshness without stopping life or stepping away from responsibilities. Chapter 1. Why Rest is Not Enough. Most people believe mental exhaustion comes from doing too much, but very often it comes from how the mind stays active, even when nothing demanding is happening. You may be sitting calmly, taking a break, or lying down, yet your thoughts continue looping through unfinished tasks, future concerns, and subtle self-pressure. This background activity keeps using energy without giving the mind any feeling of release. The mind is not drained by movement alone, but by constant interpretation, evaluation, and emotional adjustment. Every small decision, every inner reaction, and every silent comparison keeps the mind slightly tense. Over time, this tension feels normal, and mental fatigue becomes something you stop questioning. This is why rest sometimes feels ineffective. The body slows down, but the mind remains alert, scanning and managing as if something important might happen at any moment. Without awareness, rest turns into idle time rather than true mental recovery. Waking up mentally tired after proper sleep can feel confusing and frustrating. Physically, you may feel restored, yet mentally you feel dull, unfocused, or disconnected. This happens when mental patterns never truly shut down, even during quiet moments. Mental fatigue is not a weakness or a lack of motivation. It is often a sign that your mind has been carrying too many invisible responsibilities without clear limits. When alertness becomes constant, energy slowly drains without obvious effort. Real mental recharge begins when the mind feels safe enough to stop controlling everything. This safety does not come from doing nothing, but from changing how seriously the mind treats every thought. When internal pressure softens, clarity and energy begin to return naturally. In this chapter, nothing needs to be forced or fixed. You are simply learning why rest alone rarely refreshes the mind. That understanding itself quietly starts restoring mental strength. When the mind stays active for long periods without clear pauses, it slowly forgets what genuine ease feels like. And even neutral moments begin to carry a quiet tension, as if something always needs attention. Simple situations that require no effort are treated like problems to manage, keeping the mind slightly alert, even when nothing is wrong. This constant inner readiness uses mental energy continuously without providing clarity or resolution in return. You may notice that even during ordinary activities, your attention is rarely fully present, because one part of the mind is replaying the past, another is preparing for the future, and another is silently evaluating how well you are coping. This split focus feels familiar and normal, yet it fragments mental energy into small pieces that never fully settle. Over time, this scattered attention becomes a major source of exhaustion, even when life appears calm on the surface. As this pattern continues, the mind learns to stay busy even in silence, filling every quiet moment with thinking, planning, or subtle self-talk. Stillness begins to feel uncomfortable, not because it is harmful, but because the mind has forgotten how to rest without control. Instead of restoring energy, quiet moments become mentally noisy, leaving no space for true recovery. This habit often develops without awareness, shaped by constant information, emotional pressure, and the belief that staying mentally active means staying responsible. Gradually, the mind stops trusting calm, treating it as unproductive or unsafe. As a result, rest becomes shallow and relaxation feels incomplete rather than refreshing. The body may slow down, but the mind continues scanning for what might need attention next. even during breaks, weekends, or vacations. This is why mental tiredness often follows you everywhere, regardless of how much time you take off. Without changing how the mind uses attention, changing environments alone rarely restores clarity. Much of this ongoing drain comes from unresolved thoughts and unprocessed emotions that quietly stay active in the background. Small frustrations, ignored feelings, and unfinished inner conversations keep demanding mental energy without ever asking loudly. Because this effort is subtle, it is often mistaken for normal tiredness rather than recognized as mental overload. In this chapter, the goal is not to stop thinking or force calm, but to notice how much effort the mind is using unnecessarily. Awareness gently weakens the habit of constant engagement without struggle, and as this effort reduces, mental energy begins to return naturally, without rest, resistance, or force. Chapter 2. The Hidden Mental Load. As you begin to understand how constant mental activity drains energy, it becomes clear that much of this tiredness does not come from effort, but from the quiet weight the mind carries without ever setting it down. These are not tasks you actively work on, but thoughts, expectations, and emotional responsibilities that remain present in the background throughout the day. Because this weight feels familiar, it is rarely questioned, even though it continuously uses mental energy. Your mind keeps track of what still feels unfinished, what could have gone better, and what might require attention next, even when nothing immediate is happening. This background tracking creates a subtle sense of pressure, as if the mind must stay ready at all times. Over long periods, this constant readiness slowly turns into mental heaviness and reduced clarity. Unlike physical effort, this mental load does not end when an activity finishes. A conversation that felt slightly uncomfortable, a decision you are unsure about, or a responsibility you are trying to manage internally can stay active long after the moment has passed. The mind keeps these experiences alive as unfinished loops, quietly returning to them again and again. This is why you may feel mentally tired, even on days that are not busy. The body pauses between actions, but the mind continues carrying unresolved thoughts forward without releasing them. Without awareness, this invisible effort becomes part of your normal mental state. Many people believe this heaviness is simply the cost of being responsible or thoughtful. They assume mental fatigue means they are doing life seriously. In reality, much of this load comes from the habit of holding too many things in the mind at once. The mind holds on because it believes this effort provides control and safety. It replays situations to avoid mistakes, prepare for outcomes, or reduce uncertainty. While this intention feels protective, the constant effort quietly drains energy instead of preserving it. As this hidden load grows, attention becomes scattered. Focus feels difficult not because you lack ability, but because your mental space is already crowded. Mental tiredness, then, is not emptiness, but overload. When you begin to see this clearly, your relationship with fatigue changes. Instead of pushing harder or blaming yourself, you recognize tiredness as a signal that the mind has been carrying too much for too long. This understanding alone reduces pressure. In this chapter, nothing needs to be fixed or forced. You are simply learning to notice what your mind has been holding quietly in the background. And once this weight is seen clearly, it begins to loosen, allowing mental energy to return naturally. As this hidden mental load continues, the mind slowly loses its sense of completion, because nothing ever feels fully finished or safely put away. Even when tasks end and days move forward, the mind keeps returning to what could have been done better, what still feels uncertain, or what might demand attention later. This constant return prevents mental energy from settling and renewing itself. Over time, this creates a feeling of mental heaviness that is difficult to explain because there is no single clear cause. You may feel tired without being overworked, distracted without being overstimulated, or emotionally flat without feeling sad. This happens because the mind is busy holding many small concerns at once, none of which feel urgent enough to release. The mind often believes that holding on to these thoughts is responsible behavior. It assumes that remembering, reviewing, and anticipating will prevent mistakes or protect you from discomfort. While this belief feels logical, it keeps the mind in a state of low-level tension that never fully relaxes. Because this tension is subtle, it rarely triggers alarm. Instead, it quietly becomes part of how the mind operates every day. You may not notice how much effort is being used, only that clarity feels harder to reach and focus fades more quickly than it used to. Mental energy is not restored by pushing harder against this state. Trying to force focus or motivation often adds another layer of pressure. The mind does not need more effort, it needs less unnecessary holding. When the mind begins to recognize what it is carrying without purpose, something important shifts. Thoughts no longer feel equally important, and emotional signals no longer demand immediate reaction. This does not mean becoming careless, but becoming selective with attention. As selectiveness grows, mental space slowly opens. Focus improves not because you try harder, but because there is more room to concentrate. Clarity returns as the background noise reduces on its own. This is the quiet beginning of real mental recharge. Nothing dramatic happens and no technique is forced. The mind simply stops carrying what it does not need. By the end of this chapter, the goal is not to feel completely refreshed, but to clearly see how much energy has been tied up unnecessarily. That clarity itself reduces the load, and when the load reduces, mental energy begins to return naturally without rest, resistance, or effort. Chapter 3. Why your mind never feels finished. One of the quiet reasons the mind struggles to recharge is because it rarely experiences a true sense of completion, even after tasks are done and days come to an end. Instead of feeling finished, the mind keeps small threads open, replaying what could have been handled differently or what might still need attention later. This lack of closure keeps mental energy suspended rather than restored. The mind is designed to seek resolution, but modern life rarely offers clear stopping points. Work blends into rest, responsibilities follow you home, and thoughts continue long after actions stop. Without realizing it, the mind stays in an ongoing, almost done state that never fully resolves. Even simple activities can feel mentally unfinished. A conversation that ends politely may still replay internally. A decision that seemed fine may invite second-guessing, and a completed task may trigger thoughts about what comes next. Each unfinished loop quietly asks for attention. Because these loops are subtle, the mind does not treat them as problems to solve, but as background responsibilities to hold. This creates a constant low-level engagement that feels normal, yet steadily consumes energy. Over time, mental tiredness becomes less about effort and more about never arriving at a sense of rest. Many people try to fix this by becoming more productive or organized. They believe that doing more or planning better will finally bring relief. While structure helps externally, it does not automatically give the mind permission to stop processing internally. The mind often continues working because it does not recognize when something is complete. It keeps scanning for improvements, risks, or missing pieces, even when nothing meaningful can be added. This habit keeps attention slightly tense, preventing mental release. When completion is missing, rest feels unsatisfying. You may stop working, but the mind keeps hovering near tasks, ideas, and expectations. This hovering state feels like rest on the surface, but mentally it is still effort. Real mental recharge begins when the mind learns to recognize completion internally, not just externally. This does not mean ignoring responsibilities, but allowing thoughts to settle once something no longer requires action. When the mind senses closure, energy naturally begins to return. In this chapter, the focus is not on forcing closure, but on noticing how often the mind stays open without reason. Awareness helps the mind gently release what no longer needs attention. And as unfinished loops begin to close, mental clarity slowly becomes easier to access. When the mind stays open-ended for too long, it begins to confuse readiness with usefulness, treating constant mental engagement as a sign that something important is still happening. Even when no action is required, the mind remains slightly active, holding ideas loosely instead of placing them down. This ongoing readiness prevents the deep settling that allows mental energy to return. You may notice that the moment you pause, the mind quickly fills the space with reminders, reflections, or imagined future scenarios. It does this not because these thoughts are urgent, but because it has learned to associate stillness with missing something. Over time, the mind becomes uncomfortable with stopping completely. This creates a subtle tension where nothing feels fully concluded. Tasks end, but thoughts linger, and decisions are made, but doubts remain nearby. The mind stays half-engaged, as if waiting for permission to finally rest. Because this state feels familiar, it often goes unnoticed. You may assume this is simply how thinking works, or that being mentally busy means being responsible. In reality, much of this activity serves no purpose beyond maintaining the habit of engagement. The mind often resists closure because closure feels like letting go of control. It believes that staying mentally involved will prevent mistakes or regret. While this belief feels protective, it keeps the mind from experiencing relief. True mental completion is not about certainty, but about allowing things to be unfinished without continuing to hold them mentally. When the mind learns that it does not need to monitor everything, a sense of quiet relief begins to appear. As this relief grows, attention naturally becomes steadier. Focus improves not through effort, but because fewer thoughts are competing for space. The mind begins to feel lighter simply by carrying less. This is why learning to recognize when something no longer needs attention is so powerful. It allows the mind to place thoughts down instead of carrying them forward. Energy returns not because you rest more, but because you release what no longer serves you. In this chapter, the aim is to help the mind feel safe enough to experience completion internally. Nothing is forced, and nothing is rushed. As the mind slowly learns to stop hovering, clarity and calm begin to emerge naturally. Chapter 4. The pressure to always be mentally available. One of the reasons the mind struggles to recharge is the quiet pressure to always be mentally available, as if you must remain ready to think, respond, and manage at any moment, even when nothing is actually required. This pressure does not come only from work or responsibilities, but from an internal belief that staying mentally alert equals being reliable, careful, or in control. Over time, this belief keeps the mind switched on without pause. You may notice that even during personal time, your mind does not fully disengage. Part of it stays ready to reply, plan, remember, or anticipate, as if stepping away completely might cause something important to be missed. This constant readiness prevents the mind from entering a deeper state of ease. Unlike physical availability, mental availability has no clear boundaries. You can leave a place, finish a task, or end a conversation, but the mind often remains present long after the situation has passed. This creates a feeling of never fully being off, even when life appears calm. Because this state is subtle, it often feels normal. You may not notice the effort of staying mentally open, only the fatigue that slowly builds beneath it. Over time, clarity feels harder to reach, and focus feels more fragile than it used to be. The mind often believes that remaining available is a form of responsibility. It stays alert to prevent mistakes, manage impressions, or respond quickly if needed. While this intention feels practical, it keeps attention slightly tense throughout the day. True mental recharge begins when the mind learns that it does not need to stay available at all times. This does not mean ignoring responsibilities, but allowing attention to close when nothing requires it. When the mind feels permission to disengage, energy begins to return naturally. As mental availability softens, the mind starts to feel more contained and grounded. Thoughts become clearer because they are no longer competing with constant background readiness. Focus improves not through effort, but through relief. In this chapter, the goal is not to withdraw from life, but to notice how often the mind stays open without reason. Awareness gently reduces the pressure to always be on. And as that pressure eases, the mind begins to feel lighter, calmer, and more refreshed. When the mind remains mentally available for long periods, it slowly forgets how to fully withdraw, because it has learned that staying slightly alert feels safer than letting attention rest completely. Even during moments that should feel personal or quiet, a part of the mind stays open, listening for demands that may never arrive. This constant openness keeps mental energy engaged without purpose. You may notice that your thoughts rarely settle into one place for long, because attention is always half ready to move elsewhere if needed. This creates a background sense of restlessness, where calm never feels deep enough to be restoring. Over time, this shallow calm becomes exhausting in itself. The mind often confuses availability with importance. It believes that staying ready makes you more responsible, more capable, or more in control of life. While this belief feels reassuring, it keeps attention slightly tense, preventing the mind from fully relaxing into the present moment. Because this tension is subtle, it does not feel stressful in an obvious way. Instead, it shows up as mental fatigue, reduced focus, and a sense that clarity slips away easily. You may feel as if your mind is always partially occupied, even when nothing specific is happening. This pattern also affects how you experience rest. You may stop working or step away from tasks, but the mind continues to monitor, plan, or prepare internally. Rest becomes a pause in activity rather than a release of attention. True mental ease begins when the mind learns that it does not need to remain open at all times to stay safe or effective. Allowing attention to close gently when nothing requires it gives the mind permission to settle. This settling is where real mental energy begins to return. As availability softens, thoughts become fewer and more meaningful. Focus feels steadier because attention is no longer scattered across imagined demands. The mind begins to feel contained rather than stretched. In this chapter, the aim is to help the mind recognize that it is allowed to be unavailable at times. Nothing important is lost when attention rests. And as this understanding grows, mental clarity and calm begin to deepen naturally, without effort or resistance. Chapter 5. Thinking without recovery. When the mind is used constantly without recovery, it begins to operate in a continuous thinking mode, where thoughts flow endlessly without clear pauses or natural stopping points. This does not always feel intense or dramatic, but it creates a steady background effort that slowly drains mental energy. Over time, thinking itself becomes tiring, even when the thoughts are not particularly heavy or emotional. You may notice that your mind moves quickly from one idea to another without ever settling, as if it is scanning for something useful, meaningful, or necessary to hold on to. This scanning feels productive on the surface, but internally it prevents the mind from fully processing or releasing anything. As a result, mental energy is spent without creating clarity. The mind often believes that constant thinking is required to stay prepared. It keeps reviewing situations, imagining future outcomes, and replaying recent moments, even when no action is possible. This habit keeps attention active long after its usefulness has passed. Because thinking is internal, its cost is easy to ignore. You may not notice how much effort is being used, only that focus feels weaker and mental freshness fades faster than before. Over time, this constant activity creates a sense of dullness rather than sharpness. When the mind never fully recovers, even small tasks begin to feel heavier. Decisions take more effort, concentration slips more easily, and emotional reactions feel harder to regulate. This happens not because the mind is incapable, but because it has not been given space to reset. Recovery for the mind does not mean stopping thought completely. It means allowing thoughts to slow down naturally when they are no longer needed. When thinking continues out of habit rather than necessity, it quietly exhausts the system. Many people try to solve this by pushing harder, forcing focus, or adding stimulation. While these strategies may create short bursts of energy, they do not address the underlying lack of mental recovery. In some cases, they make the cycle even stronger. Real mental recovery begins when the mind learns that it does not need to keep moving to stay effective. Allowing thoughts to pass without chasing them gives attention a chance to settle. This settling restores energy more deeply than effort ever can. In this chapter, the intention is not to control thinking, but to recognize when thinking has become automatic rather than useful. Awareness gently interrupts the cycle of constant mental motion, and as this motion slows, the mind begins to feel clearer, steadier, and quietly refreshed again. When thinking continues without recovery, the mind slowly loses its ability to distinguish between thoughts that are useful and thoughts that are simply habitual, allowing everything to occupy attention equally and without priority. This creates a state where the mind feels busy but not productive, active but not clear, as if movement itself has replaced meaning. Over time, this constant engagement dulls mental sharpness instead of strengthening it. You may notice that even when a thought has no solution, no action, and no real value, the mind still returns to it repeatedly. This repetition is not driven by need, but by momentum, as if the mind has learned to keep moving simply because it always has. Each return uses a small amount of energy without providing insight, closure, or relief. Because the mind rarely experiences a full pause, it begins to operate in a low-energy state by default. Focus becomes fragile, clarity feels delayed, and simple thinking requires more effort than it once did. This is not because the mind is failing, but because it has been used continuously without the chance to recover properly. When recovery is missing, the mind often compensates by speeding up or jumping between thoughts more quickly. This creates the illusion of productivity, as if movement equals effectiveness, but internally it increases fatigue. The faster the mind moves, the less space it has to settle or reset. Many people respond to this state by adding stimulation, pressure, or distraction, hoping to regain sharpness or motivation. While these approaches may create short bursts of alertness, they do not restore mental energy. In many cases, they deepen the cycle by keeping the mind in constant motion. True mental recovery does not come from forcing silence or stopping thoughts completely. It comes from allowing the mind to slow naturally when thinking is no longer necessary. This slowing happens when thoughts are allowed to pass without being followed, judged, or expanded. As this gentle slowing becomes familiar, thinking starts to feel lighter and more intentional. Thoughts arise when needed and fade when they are finished, instead of lingering by habit. The mind feels clearer not because it is empty, but because it is no longer crowded. This change often feels subtle at first. You may simply notice that decisions feel easier, focus lasts longer, and inner resistance softens. These small shifts signal that recovery is quietly returning to the thinking process. In this chapter, the purpose is to help you recognize that thinking itself needs recovery, just like the body does. When thoughts are given space to settle, mental energy begins to return without force or effort. And as recovery becomes part of how the mind operates, clarity and calm start to feel natural again. Chapter 6. The Cost of Constant Self-Monitoring. When the mind spends too much time watching itself, checking its performance, and evaluating how it appears or feels, a large amount of mental energy is quietly consumed without any clear benefit. This self-monitoring does not always feel obvious, but it keeps attention turned inward in a way that prevents ease. Over time, the mind becomes both the worker and the supervisor, never fully resting in either role. You may notice this as a constant background awareness of how you are doing, whether you are focused enough, calm enough, productive enough, or handling things the right way. Even during simple moments, part of the mind stays busy assessing and correcting. This internal observation feels responsible, but it keeps the mind slightly tense. Self-monitoring often develops as a way to stay safe or acceptable. The mind believes that by watching closely, it can prevent mistakes, avoid embarrassment, or maintain control. While this intention is protective, the effort required to keep watching quietly drains mental energy throughout the day. Because this monitoring is internal, it rarely feels like work. You may not notice the effort itself, only the fatigue that follows. Over time, clarity fades, and focus feels harder to maintain, even when nothing demanding is happening externally. When the mind is always observing itself, it struggles to fully engage with the present moment. Attention is split between experiencing life and checking how that experience is going. This division reduces depth and makes even pleasant moments feel slightly incomplete. Mental energy begins to return when the mind is allowed to experience without constant evaluation. This does not mean losing awareness, but loosening the need to judge every thought and reaction. When observation softens, attention naturally settles. As this settling grows, thinking feels less heavy and more direct. Focus improves because attention is no longer divided between doing and checking. The mind feels clearer simply because it is no longer watching itself so closely. This shift often feels subtle, like a quiet release rather than a dramatic change. You may notice more ease in simple tasks and less resistance when focusing. These are signs that energy is no longer being spent on unnecessary monitoring. In this chapter, the aim is not to stop awareness, but to recognize when self-monitoring has become excessive. By gently reducing this habit, the mind learns to trust itself again. And as trust replaces constant checking, mental energy begins to return naturally and steadily. When self-monitoring continues unchecked, the mind slowly loses its natural sense of flow, because attention is constantly pulled back to assess, adjust, and correct, instead of being allowed to move forward freely. This creates a mental environment where nothing feels fully settled, as if every action or thought needs approval before it can pass. Over time, this habit quietly drains confidence and energy at the same time. You may experience this as a subtle inner commentary that follows you throughout the day, noticing how you speak, how you react, and how well you are managing situations. Even when things are going fine, the mind keeps checking, asking whether you should be doing better or feeling differently. This ongoing evaluation keeps attention divided and slightly tense. Because self-monitoring often feels intelligent or careful, it rarely raises concern. You may believe that watching yourself closely helps you improve or stay in control. In reality, constant observation interrupts natural thinking and replaces ease with effort. When the mind is busy monitoring, it has less energy to actually process experiences. Feelings are judged before they are felt, and thoughts are analyzed before they are completed. This interruption prevents emotional and mental resolution, leaving experiences unfinished. Over time, this creates a sense of mental fatigue that does not improve with rest. Even quiet moments feel effortful because the mind continues observing itself instead of relaxing into experience. Awareness becomes tight instead of open. Mental recovery begins when self-monitoring softens into simple awareness. This means allowing thoughts and feelings to exist without immediately evaluating them. When experience is allowed to unfold naturally, the mind uses far less energy. As this shift develops, attention becomes steadier and less reactive. You may notice that focus lasts longer and that inner resistance decreases. The mind feels calmer not because it is controlled, but because it is no longer being watched so closely. This change does not remove responsibility or awareness. Instead, it replaces constant checking with quiet trust. The mind learns that it does not need to supervise every moment to function well. In this chapter, the goal is to recognize how much energy is spent on watching yourself rather than living. As self-monitoring gently reduces, mental space opens, and in that space, clarity, calm, and energy begin to return naturally, without force or effort. Chapter 7. Emotional holding and mental drain. A large amount of mental energy is quietly spent on holding emotions that were never fully processed, expressed, or allowed to move through you, causing the mind to stay busy, managing feelings instead of recovering from them. These emotions may not feel intense, but they remain present in subtle ways, shaping thoughts, reactions, and inattention throughout the day. Because they are familiar, the effort required to hold them often goes unnoticed. You may find yourself keeping emotions contained so that life continues smoothly, choosing control over expression and stability over release. While this helps you function, it also requires continuous inner effort, as the mind must constantly regulate what is felt and what is shown. Over time, this regulation becomes exhausting. Emotional holding often develops as a survival skill. The mind learns that staying composed, reasonable, or unaffected is safer than feeling deeply. While this strategy protects you in the short term, it prevents emotions from completing their natural cycle. Unfinished emotions quietly demand energy. When emotions are not allowed to settle, the mind keeps revisiting them in indirect ways. They appear as overthinking, irritability, low motivation, or a sense of heaviness that has no clear explanation. The mind tries to manage what the heart was never allowed to feel fully. Because this process happens internally, it is rarely recognized as work. You may believe you are simply tired, distracted, or unmotivated, without realizing how much energy is being used to keep emotions contained. Over time, mental clarity fades as emotional weight accumulates. True emotional recovery does not require dramatic expression or constant analysis. It begins when the mind allows emotions to be present without immediately controlling them. This gentle allowance reduces the effort required to manage inner experience. As emotions are allowed to exist without resistance, the mind no longer needs to keep guarding them. Thoughts become clearer because they are no longer shaped by suppressed feeling. Focus improves because attention is no longer divided between thinking and holding. This shift often feels quiet and relieving rather than intense. You may notice a sense of lightness or ease without knowing exactly why. These are signs that emotional energy is being released instead of stored. In this chapter, the intention is not to dig into emotions, but to recognize how much energy is spent holding them back. When emotional holding softens, the mind no longer needs to work as hard. And as that effort reduces, mental energy begins to return naturally, bringing clarity, calm, and inner steadiness. When emotional holding becomes a habit, The mind slowly takes on the role of constant regulator, deciding what can be felt, how much can be shown, and when feelings should be pushed aside. This ongoing regulation keeps attention busy in the background, even when nothing emotionally intense is happening. Over time, this quiet effort becomes a steady source of mental fatigue. You may notice that certain emotions are automatically softened, delayed, or ignored, not because they are unimportant, but because the mind believes they might disrupt stability or control. While this helps you function outwardly, it requires continuous inner effort to maintain. The mind never fully rests while it is guarding emotions. Emotions that are held back do not disappear. They remain active beneath the surface, influencing mood, thoughts, and reactions in indirect ways. The mind must then manage both the emotion itself and the effort of keeping it contained. This double task quietly drains mental energy. Because this process happens gradually, it often feels normal. You may not recognize emotional holding as effort, only as a general sense of tiredness or heaviness that lingers. Over time, this weight affects clarity, focus, and emotional responsiveness. Mental energy begins to return when emotions are allowed to be present without immediate control or judgment. This does not mean acting on every feeling, but letting emotions exist internally without suppression. When feelings are not resisted, the mind no longer needs to work as hard. As emotional resistance softens, attention becomes less divided. Thoughts feel clearer because they are no longer shaped by hidden emotional tension. Focus improves because mental space is no longer occupied by unprocessed feeling. This shift often brings a sense of inner ease rather than dramatic change. You may notice that reactions soften and mental noise reduces. These are signs that emotional energy is being released instead of stored. In this chapter, the aim is to help you see how emotional holding contributes to mental drain. Awareness alone reduces the effort required to manage feelings, and as that effort decreases, the mind naturally begins to feel lighter, calmer, and more balanced again. Chapter 8. The Illusion of Mental Control. The mind often feels tired, not because life is overwhelming, but because it is constantly trying to manage every thought, emotion, and possible outcome, believing that control will prevent discomfort and uncertainty. This effort does not usually feel aggressive or stressful. Instead, it feels careful, thoughtful, and responsible. Yet beneath this calm surface, the mind remains quietly tense, always holding itself in check. You may notice this control in the way thoughts are immediately corrected, emotions are adjusted before they fully form, and situations are replayed to ensure nothing went wrong. The mind stays alert, believing that staying ahead will reduce future problems. While this feels protective, it keeps attention locked in continuous effort without relief. Control often begins as a useful skill. At some point, it helped you stay composed, make better decisions, or avoid mistakes. Over time, however, it becomes automatic, applied even when it is no longer needed. The mind continues managing simply because it has forgotten how to trust natural flow. When control becomes constant, ease disappears quietly. Even moments that should feel light or peaceful are subtly managed, as if relaxation itself requires supervision. This creates a low-level strain that follows you throughout the day, making rest feel shallow rather than restoring. The real drain is not thinking itself, but the belief that every inner experience must be handled, shaped, or improved. Thoughts are not allowed to come and go freely, and emotions are not allowed to rise and settle on their own. Because of this interference, inner processes remain incomplete and continue occupying mental space. Mental energy begins to return when control slowly softens into trust. This does not mean becoming careless or passive, but allowing thoughts and feelings to move without immediate correction. When the mind stops interfering unnecessarily, it naturally uses less energy. As trust replaces control, attention becomes steadier and more grounded. Thoughts pass without resistance, emotions flow without being suppressed, and the mind feels clearer because it is no longer fighting itself internally. This clarity does not come from effort, but from release. At first, this shift can feel unfamiliar or even uncomfortable because control has long been associated with strength and safety. Letting go may feel risky, as if something important might be missed. With time, however, ease begins to replace effort, and calm starts to feel natural again. In this chapter, the intention is not to remove control completely, but to recognize where it has quietly become unnecessary. Awareness allows the mind to loosen its grip without force, and as that grip relaxes, mental energy begins to return on its own, bringing clarity, balance, and inner steadiness. As control slowly relaxes, the mind begins to notice how much effort was previously being used just to keep everything contained, corrected, and predictable, even when life itself was not demanding that level of involvement. This realization does not come as a sudden insight, but as a gradual sense of relief, where the mind feels less tight and less responsible for managing every inner movement. With this easing, mental energy that was locked in control starts becoming available again. You may begin to notice moments where thoughts pass without needing correction, and emotions rise without immediately being shaped or suppressed. These moments can feel unfamiliar at first, because the mind is used to intervening quickly. Yet, as interference reduces, experience starts to feel smoother and less fragmented. Control often convinces the mind that letting go will lead to chaos or mistakes. In reality, most thoughts and emotions do not need supervision to resolve themselves. When allowed to move naturally, they tend to settle on their own without creating problems. As this trust develops, attention becomes less reactive. Instead of jumping in to manage every sensation or idea, the mind stays present and observant. This presence feels calmer, not because effort has increased, but because effort has been removed. The reduction of control also changes how rest is experienced. Rest no longer feels like something you have to do correctly or efficiently. It becomes a natural state where the mind is not trying to improve itself. In this state, even short pauses begin to feel genuinely restoring. Mental clarity improves as well, not because the mind is trying to focus harder, but because fewer inner processes are competing for space. Decisions feel simpler, thoughts feel cleaner, and emotional reactions feel proportionate rather than exaggerated. This clarity is a natural outcome of reduced interference. Over time, the mind learns that control is not the same as strength. True mental strength comes from flexibility, from the ability to allow experience without resistance. This flexibility uses far less energy and creates far more stability. In the later stages of this shift, you may notice a quiet confidence emerging. The mind no longer feels the need to constantly prove that it is managing things well. It trusts itself to respond when needed, rather than staying permanently alert. This chapter completes with an understanding that mental control, while once useful, becomes draining when it turns into a constant habit. By recognizing where control is unnecessary, the mind naturally loosens its grip, and as that grip relaxes, mental energy returns steadily, making space for clarity, calm, and a deeper sense of inner balance that does not require effort to maintain. Chapter 9. When your mind is never truly present. One of the quieter reasons mental energy keeps draining is that the mind is rarely fully present in what it is doing, because attention is constantly divided between the current moment and something else that feels mentally relevant. Even during simple activities, part of the mind is elsewhere, reviewing the past, preparing for the future, or subtly evaluating how things are going. This split attention prevents the mind from settling into any experience deeply enough to feel restoring. You may notice this as a sense of drifting while doing ordinary things, where your body is present, but your mind feels slightly removed. Tasks get done, conversations happen, and time passes, yet there is little sense of fullness or completion. Because attention never fully arrives, energy is used without satisfaction. The mind often believes that staying partially ahead or behind is practical. It assumes that presence is inefficient and that multitasking internally will keep life under control. While this habit feels intelligent, it keeps the mind in constant motion, unable to fully engage or fully rest. When attention is divided, even enjoyable moments lose their depth. Pleasure feels muted, rest feels shallow, and focus feels fragile. The mind touches many moments lightly, but never settles into any of them. Over time, this creates a feeling of mental emptiness despite constant activity. This pattern also affects how quickly the mind becomes tired. Because attention is spread thin, even small demands feel draining. The mind is working in many directions at once, using energy inefficiently. Fatigue appears not because life is heavy, but because attention is scattered. Mental energy begins to return when attention is allowed to gather instead of being split. This does not require forcing focus or blocking thoughts, but gently noticing when the mind is not where the body is. When attention returns to the present, effort decreases naturally. As presence deepens, experiences begin to feel more complete. Simple actions feel more satisfying, and pauses feel more restful. The mind gains energy not because it is doing less, but because it is doing one thing at a time. This shift often feels subtle but meaningful. You may notice that time feels slower, reactions feel softer, and mental noise reduces. These are signs that attention is no longer being pulled in multiple directions. In this chapter, the aim is to recognize how often the mind is absent without realizing it. Awareness gently brings attention back without force, and as presence becomes more familiar, mental energy begins to rebuild quietly, creating a sense of steadiness and clarity that does not rely on effort. When the mind lives slightly ahead or behind the moment, it misses the stabilizing effect of being fully where it is, and this absence quietly increases mental effort without producing clarity or satisfaction. Attention keeps shifting between what just happened, what might happen next, and how things should feel, creating a constant internal movement that never fully settles. This movement consumes energy because the mind is always adjusting instead of arriving. You may notice that even during rest, attention does not fully land. The body pauses, but the mind continues to wander through thoughts, memories, or imagined futures, as if being present is not enough. This prevents rest from feeling complete, because presence is what allows the mind to actually recharge. The habit of not being present often feels automatic. The mind learned long ago that staying ahead might prevent problems, and staying behind might help avoid mistakes. While these habits once felt useful, they now keep attention fragmented, making even simple moments feel mentally busy. When presence is missing, the mind struggles to register completion. Experiences begin but do not fully end because attention was never fully there to begin with. This leaves a subtle sense of dissatisfaction, even when life is moving smoothly. Mental fatigue increases under these conditions because the mind is constantly transitioning. It moves from thought to thought, moment to moment, without grounding itself anywhere. This constant shifting uses more energy than steady attention ever could. Mental energy begins to rebuild when the mind is allowed to stay with what is happening now, without immediately turning it into something else. This does not require effortful concentration, but gentle permission to remain where you already are. When attention stops drifting, effort reduces on its own. As presence strengthens, the mind begins to feel more contained and less scattered. Experiences feel fuller, and pauses feel more restorative. Energy returns not because life slows down, but because attention stops being divided. Over time, this creates a sense of inner steadiness. Thoughts still appear, but they no longer pull attention away so easily. The mind becomes quieter not through force, but through grounding. In this chapter, the intention is to help you notice how absence quietly drains mental energy. Awareness brings attention back without struggle, and as presence becomes natural again, the mind finds stability, clarity, and renewal in the moment itself, without needing to escape or stop life. Chapter 10. Letting the mind recover while life continues. As the mind becomes more present and less divided, a quiet question naturally arises about how recovery can happen without stopping life, stepping away from responsibility, or creating perfect conditions that rarely exist. The answer begins with understanding that recovery is not an activity added on top of life, but a shift in how the mind relates to what is already happening. When effort reduces internally, recovery starts alongside movement. You may notice that moments of ease begin to appear in ordinary situations, not because circumstances changed, but because the mind stopped adding unnecessary tension. Walking, working, listening, or even thinking starts to feel lighter when attention is no longer overloaded. Recovery happens in small moments of release rather than long periods of rest. The mind often believes it must stop completely to recover. It waits for silence, time off, or perfect calm. While these can help, they are not required. What truly restores energy is reducing the inner habits that drain it in the first place. When those habits soften, recovery becomes continuous. As life moves forward, the mind learns to place thoughts down instead of carrying them everywhere. Situations are handled when they are present and then allowed to pass. This creates natural pauses without forcing them. Energy is preserved because attention is no longer stretched across everything at once. This way of functioning feels more sustainable. Instead of cycles of exhaustion followed by recovery, the mind stays closer to balance. Fatigue still appears at times, but it does not accumulate in the same way. Mental energy is used and restored more evenly. Recovery also becomes less dramatic. There is no need to escape or withdraw to feel better. Relief comes quietly. Through reduced resistance and simpler attention, the mind feels supported by how it operates, rather than constantly challenged by itself. Over time, this creates a sense of trust. The mind trusts that it can meet life as it is, without constant preparation or control. This trust removes a significant amount of hidden effort. With less effort, clarity becomes more stable. This chapter is not about techniques or routines, but about understanding a different relationship with mental energy. When the mind stops working against itself, recovery becomes part of daily living. Life continues, responsibilities remain, but the inner experience becomes lighter. As this understanding settles, the mind no longer waits to recharge later. It begins to recover now, in the middle of life, through presence, release, and reduced effort. And this is where lasting mental energy quietly begins to grow. As this journey comes to a close, it becomes clear that recharging the mind was never about escaping life, fixing yourself, or becoming someone different, but about removing the quiet habits that were draining energy without your awareness. The mind does not need perfect conditions to recover. It needs less resistance, less holding, and less unnecessary effort. When these reduce, recovery begins naturally, even in the middle of ordinary days. You may now notice that mental energy returns in subtle ways rather than dramatic changes. Focus lasts a little longer, reactions feel softer, and inner noise reduces without being forced. These small shifts are signs that the mind is no longer working against itself. Life continues to be busy, imperfect, and sometimes demanding, but the relationship you have with your thoughts and attention has changed. Instead of carrying everything forward, the mind learns to respond and then release. This simple shift prevents energy from being trapped in unfinished inner work. The mind begins to trust itself again. It no longer needs to stay constantly alert, controlling, or prepared for every possibility. When something requires attention, it responds. When it does not, attention is allowed to rest. This rhythm creates stability without effort. Mental clarity now comes from simplicity rather than struggle. Thoughts appear and fade without being chased. Emotions move through without being held. Presence replaces pressure, and attention becomes lighter because it is no longer divided. This is what it means to recharge without resting. Not stopping life, but stopping the internal habits that made life feel heavier than it needed to be. Energy returns because it is no longer being wasted. You may still feel tired at times, and that is natural. But this tiredness no longer feels confusing or overwhelming. It passes more easily because it is not layered with mental resistance. The mind knows how to recover as it moves. As you continue forward, there is nothing you need to remember perfectly or apply rigidly. The understanding itself continues working quietly in the background. Awareness keeps adjusting how attention is used, moment by moment. This audiobook does not end with a rule, a method, or a demand for change. It ends with permission. Permission for the mind to settle, to trust, and to release what it does not need to carry anymore. And as that permission becomes part of how you live, mental energy stops being something you chase. It becomes something that returns naturally, steadily, and quietly, while life continues exactly as it is.